All right, section 1.6, we're going to actually split this up into two videos, which will make it a little nice. That means the two videos will be a little shorter than our typical about 20-minute average here. So you should enjoy these two videos as they should be short as long as I don't go on rants like I kind of am doing now. I'm sorry. So let's start. We're going to be talking about angles in these next two videos. The definition of an angle is that it consists of two rays that have the same endpoint. If you will think of a clock, the hour and the minute hand are two rays. They have the same endpoint. They meet in the middle of the clock, and they create angles at every point of the day, right? The end point that the two rays come together and meet at is called the vertex of the angle. So notice this angle here of the mountain. This is our vertex, all right? You can kind of think of the vertex as like the elbow of the angle, if you will. Okay, if you take your arm and you bend it, you've got your hand, which is one endpoint of a ray. You've got your shoulder, which is the other endpoint of the ray, and your elbow is the vertex of your angle. All right, and the rays can be called the sides of the angle, if you will. We don't really refer to them too much as sides, but you may call them sides. Now, how to name an angle? First off, there's an angle symbol, and it kind of looks like a little baby angle. Kind of looks about maybe like a 45-degree angle, if you will. And then it takes three letters after this angle symbol. All right, and there are some exceptions that we will talk about, but primarily we're going to be using the three-letter format here. And sometimes I'll mention the three-letter format or the one-letter format. And it's always nicer to go with the one-letter format because, well, quite frankly, it's shorter. But if you want to use the three-letter format, the important thing to note here is that the middle letter must be the vertex, the elbow, if you will. So let's use the three-letter format first. So the angle in the picture can be called angle. Now notice I have 3 points here, A, B, and C, but not particularly in that order. Now A is my vertex, and it must be the middle letter. Now the B and the C, it really doesn't matter the order. So I could say B, A, C, and again, the important thing to note is that that vertex letter is at the middle letter. Or just like with lines and segments, we can flip around the order. We could say CAB instead. Again, notice that the A is in the middle. That is fine. Now there is an exception where you could just use the vertex letter, angle A. And there are some times where you can do it and sometimes you cannot. We will talk about when you can and when you cannot. In this example, you could call this just angle A. That would be fine. There is no other angle you could confuse with angle A. There's only one angle A up there. Okay, but there might be times where there's multiple angle A's, and then we can't use the single letter format. Now, occasionally you might notice some numbers kind of inside the elbow here. Now, occasionally there will be numbers in there that are more naming numbers. And then sometimes there's going to be numbers in there where it might say, like 60 degrees. So you might have to notice the differences between when numbers are used to name angles and when numbers are used to measure angles. So in this case, we could call this angle 1. Okay? So there's four different possibilities for this one example. And notice each time I use the angle symbol out in front. Very important that you do that. So in the first example, how many angles exist? How many different angles are there? Okay, and some people might go, oh, there's two. There's this angle and there's that angle. But you also need to consider this whole angle altogether. So really there are three unique angles that exist, and name each of those angles in as many ways as possible. So let's start with the biggest angle. The biggest angle being this whole thing here. Let's start off with the three-letter format. Now, in this big angle here, the Q, it's the vertex. So it's got to go in the middle. The other two ends are the P and the R, and it doesn't matter which way they go. So that would be acceptable. Notice there is no number in here, so I couldn't call this like angle 1 or angle 2 or angle 3. Now here's an example of where you cannot use the single vertex. You cannot use the single letter format. I could not refer to this as angle Q, and let me explain why. This is an angle Q, but so is this little angle, it's an angle Q, and so is this other little angle below it, it's an angle Q. there's technically 3 angle Qs. So that's why we can't use the single letter format in this case. All right. There are more than one angle Q here. So we have to use the 3-letter format. So let's talk about the small angle on top. Okay, this guy right here. Again, I can't call it angle Q, but I could use the 3-letter format. And again, Q's got to be in the middle because it's still the vertex, it's still the elbow. So we could call it PQS, or angle, switch it around, SQP. And that's it. And then the small angle on the bottom. Again, Q is the vertex, so it's got to go in the middle. And then its 2 endpoints are the S and the R here. So we could say angle SQR, or angle, flip it around, RQS. So those are all the possible names. We could name any of those angles. Again, the single letter format doesn't work because there are multiple of those particular angle Qs. All right, example 2. I'm going to have you guys do this one on your own. So name that angle in as many ways as possible. And I will give you a hint. There are 4 possibilities that you can do there. So we will discuss that tomorrow. The measure of an angle is written in units called degrees, and the measure of angle A is denoted by M angle A. Now, some people in the past have gotten confused about that M. Sometimes they think that means like a variable, like X. Like there's X angle A's, and we don't know how many angle A's we really have. But that M that's in front of there, in front of the angle symbol, just means the measure. That means that you're going to be talking about that this is specifically going to be given a number in degrees. And there are other ways to measure angles besides degrees, but you will get there when you hit more like pre-calc. There are radians, and then if you get really beyond that, then there's gradians, and there's just a handful of other ways that you can measure angles. But we're going to stick with good old degrees here. And what's the name of this contraption? A good old protractor. Measures angles for us. Okay. So again, if you see that M, that just means that you're going to be talking about a specific value. We might say the measure of angle A equals 100 degrees. So that specific number implies we need to see that M in there. They will go hand in hand. 2 angles are congruent angles if they have the same measure. In the diagram below, the 2 angles have the same measure, so angle DEF is congruent to angle PQR, and we can again use, where's my pen? There we go. We can use the congruent symbol. Now notice there are not specific values here. Like I didn't say this is a 150-degree angle and this is a 150-degree angle. So we're not given specific values to these 2 angles, but we are told that these 2 angles are in fact the same measure. It's just an unknown value. All right. Now there is, I'm trying to remember. Let me show you real quick. There are some congruent angle markings, just like we had for segments. Okay. So remember when we had, let's say, one segment, we split it up into 2, and we said, well, here are congruent segment symbols here. It was just a little baby segment, if you will, right in the middle of those 2 segments. Well, if we want to say that 2 angles are congruent, I use things called arc marks. Okay, you kind of fill in that gap between your 2 rays. And since I use one arc mark and one arc mark, I'm saying those 2 angles are congruent. Sometimes there might be 2 arc marks on the 2 angles. And as long as they have the same number of arc marks, they are congruent. Now, if this was what you saw, 2 arc marks and 1 arc mark, they have a different number of arc marks, therefore they are not congruent to each other. Just keep that in mind. We will definitely talk about that more in depth as we go on. Types of angles, this should be super easy for you. A 90-degree angle is exactly a right angle. A straight, let's do acute. Acute is a small little guy. It's a little cute guy. It's between 0 and 90. Obtuse is a big angle between 90 and 180. And a straight angle is exactly 180 degrees. Okay. Here's a little FYI, just in case one day you're on Jeopardy and this question comes up. An angle that is greater than 180 degrees is called what? 2 different names I've seen. Reflexive angle or an oblique angle. That is a Q there. oblique angles are bigger than 180. We don't necessarily talk about them too much, but there are specific names for them. So these four things I'm sure you are fully aware of. Just note here, special note, that the little box here for a right angle is specific for 90-degree angles. Okay, so if I got rid of, let's do this here. If I got rid of that 90, but you saw that box, you know without a doubt that's a 90-degree angle. Okay, now let's play a little what if. What if that box wasn't there? Can you look at this and go, yeah, that's a 90-degree angle. It's got to be a 90-degree angle. It looks like it. Is it a 90-degree angle without that box? And the answer is no. If that box is not there, you may not assume that it is a 90-degree angle. Okay? So don't make that assumption, because assuming does a certain thing. And if you don't know what it does, look it up. And that is all for the first video of section 1.6. So again, make sure you do that one example back here. Example 2, we will discuss it tomorrow in class. Should take maybe 2 minutes. And that is all. Adios and goodbye.